A Shalom Akim Shalom Shalom, all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim. And listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Raquai, and back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, excuse me, I kind of just wanted to go through the law and then understand the importance of being practical, right? And what inspired this lesson, I was just recalling an experience of mine in regards to being overzealous, because one of the things that when you first learn of your heritage and knowing who you are, and one of the things that 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 a lot of us go through is that spirit essentially of being super overzealous, right? And essentially trying to we're doing too much, essentially we're trying to keep the law, like keep the law, right? But you have to understand that we're in situations that we cannot keep the laws 100%. And essentially trying to keep the laws 100% can bring damnation upon yourself, right? Do we establish the law? Yes. Are there some laws we can keep? Absolutely, right? But remember, being practical, the practical component of it is that we're in a situation, we're in captivity, and there are just some things that you can't do, right? So I pray that this lesson may be edifying. I wrote a couple things down, but I kind of just gonna flow, see what happens. But so I guess I'll start off with this first precept here, right? As a matter of fact, let me get the word zeal. What is zeal, right? So it says passionate ardor in the etymology in pursuit of an objective or course of action. It says usually desirable, in brackets it says faith, study, but also of wrath or vengeance, right? So kind of like as a matter of fact, that's funny, it mentioned that, I was thinking about there's an account in Maccabees where the father of Judas, Maccabees, his name was Mattathias, he slew some guy upon the altar, if I'm not mistaken, right? That so essentially it's that burning flame of passion that you have, right? To do the right thing. It says here, in the Greek, it says zelos, ardor, eager, rivalry, emulation. This was a noble passion, right? So it's to seek, request, to desire, right? So it's a strong feeling of passionate zeal, fervency, right? So and that's one of the things that we feel, understanding, coming to realize who we are. And then in some things you realize that okay, there are some things you're in captivity, so you can't really do certain things 100%. Like for example, Passover comes around, and if you're in a situation where you cannot get all the leaven out of your house, because you might live with people who are non-believers, right? In that situation, what are you gonna do? You're gonna throw all their other stuff out. You're gonna throw their stuff out. They're not believers, right? So you have to understand essentially being peaceable as well as character too, right? Don't destroy yourself. So I guess I'll start off here in Ecclesiastes 7:16, and it says, "Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself?" Right? So, you could be in a situation where you can't, you may not live, you may not have all the funds right now to, be able to have your own space. And even in that being said, you may not have all the, we don't have all, we're in captivity at the end of the day, right? So if you're in a situation where, you live with people, you don't want to hammer them over the head, with the law. You can tell them, right? But, you don't essentially start doing things that can, what's the word I'm looking for? Sour your situation, for lack of a better word, to be honest with you. You don't want to be, as the scriptures describe, be a lion in your house, because of that flaming zeal that you have, right? And I'm speaking a little bit from experience too. I didn't want to. That's kind of what also inspired this lesson, because years ago, if I may add, politely, that living with family, and one of the mistakes I made was taking some of their food, unlawful food, and throwing it out. In the fridge there was a nice, big piece of pork, with the cloves well seasoned and everything, covered up with the foil. And, in that zeal, that passion, that ardor, in trying to, keep, trying to, as an attempt to keep all the laws 100%, so to speak, I threw it out, right? And that left a sour situation, because in that situation, living with family, that wasn't the wisest course of action, because at that situation, you can bring damnation, upon yourself, right? Especially if you don't have the resources to be able to kind of move out. Things are expensive, you're in captivity, you're working this job, so on and so forth, right? So you have to, make kind of deal with what you have, right? Until, situations might, eventually would improve. But, looking back from the situation, essentially it turned me into being a lion in my house. And that's something you want to essentially avoid, right? So what I will do, I'm actually going to get that. And I think that's Sirach, the 4th chapter. And it says, be not, Sirach chapter 4, verse 30, and it says, be not as a lion in thy house, nor frantic among thy servants, right? So don't be, essentially a tyrant, and that's the way it kind of comes across to these people, right? Because they're not on that level, that you are, right? And I kind of just doing this as an exhortation. Yes, we make mistakes. I've made that mistake. I'm not gonna be like I don't make any mistakes. I'm just being straight up and honest, right? And looking back in the situation, it wasn't the wisest thing to do, but this is what, there's always gold that comes out of, making these mistakes, right? So, other brothers can also, and a few sisters that might listen, can also learn from, others' mistakes, right? So you avoid doing these mistakes, right? So you don't want to hammer them over the head, with the law. And the law is actually very good when you think about it, right? We're supposed to be a holy people, but we're in a situation where you can't keep all the laws 100%. Going into the as a matter of fact, let me get this in Baruch. As a matter of fact, I want to get this in Exodus first, then I'll go to Baruch. Okay, this is Exodus 31, verse 15, and it says, in regards to the Sabbath, and it says, 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord Yahweh, Bashem Shai. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death, right? So, this is the way, this is part of our culture, to keep the Sabbath, and we can't even keep that to the 100%, right? Because a lot of us are in situations where we have, to go into work, right? We're as the scriptures describe, we're in captivity and we're subject to payments, right? Let me get that. That's what I want to get to next. Hold on. What's that? I think that's Baruch. Okay, this is Baruch 3 and 8. Behold, we are in yet this day in our captivity, where thou hast scattered us for a reproach, a curse, and to be subject to payments according to all the iniquities of our fathers, which departed from the Lord, Yahweh, Bashem El Shai, our power. Right? So this is our situation, right? We can't, we got mortgage, a lot of us got mortgages, a lot of us got rent to pay. We have to go into work. We need groceries. You need to eat food. You need to take care of your children. You need to take care of, you might have dependents who depend on you. Whether it's, grandfather, father, seniors, whoever. Right? You're in a situation where you're subject to payments. You got to pay this. Car insurance is due next month. You got to, take care of that. Flat tire. You got to cover these things. Right? You got to take care of these things. Right? You can't just leave these things unattended. So this is our situation, right? You gotta be practical. You're not gonna call into work and be like, hey manager, it's a Sabbath and I'll come into work this week. Can't do that, because you're gonna create a situation where you ain't gonna last very long. You ain't gonna last very long, right? You can't do that. That's not it's not wise. It's not wise, just like in my situation, learn from my situation. That wasn't wise, right? Throwing out the pork. If you live with family and they don't on the same spiritual frequency as you, just you deal with them. According to the law, honor thy father and thy mother. You can keep that, right? But you might have to share a space with them, right? Share a space with, parents, siblings, whoever, right? They're pleased to dwell with you, don't sour your situation, right? Don't do what I did, right? You have to deal with them, and then demons might jump on them, and you see smoke coming out of their ears and all this kind of stuff because you throw out their pork. Don't do what I did. Don't make my mistake, okay? I'm making light of a serious situation, but in all seriousness, just deal accordingly, right? Don't do too much, right? Don't be a roaring lion in your house, right? Right? Let me go to just bear with me 1 second. Okay, this is Acts chapter 15. I'll start at verse 9 and I'll just read to 10, and it says, and put no difference. Actually, I'll start at verse 7, actually. And when there was much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, men and brethren, ye know that how that a good while ago the Most High, which made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe, and the Most High, Yahweh Bashem El Shai, which knoweth their hearts, bear them witness, giving them the Holy Spirit, even as he did unto us, and put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. Right? You had a lot of our people that fell away from their customs, right? And then there was a bit of a what's the word I'm looking for? I want to say, I guess, contention, a rift, between those that grew up in the customs and then those that fell away, right? So this is verse 10, and it says, "Now therefore why tempt ye the Most High, and put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear," right? So verse 11, I'll read, and it says, "But we believe through the grace of our Lord Yahushua and Mashiach, we shall be saved, even as they," right? So we're in a situation, we need grace. That's what we need, right? And there were a lot of the people, because when you read up here, there were some of them of Israelites that grew up in the customs, which they had an understanding like, okay, if you weren't circumcised after the manner of Moses, you couldn't be saved, right? Our people essentially are they were being very, very overzealous. And even if you go back into the story, when you go into what happened within the third beast, in Maccabees, the Grecian Empire, now you understand why a lot of them were feeling like this, right? But we're in a situation where we need grace, right? And you have a lot of camps, and I'm reading this also because there are a lot of camps that push that vibration too, that they try to put that yoke onto a lot of believers, and thinking that they have to keep the laws 100%, right? They're trying to put that heavy yoke back on them, and it kind of neglects, basically it does neglect the importance of Yahushua, and neglecting the importance of his sacrifice and grace, right? One of the things, I noticed that the Apostle Paul, he was very, very honest in one of his letters to the Israelites in Galatia, because he talked about how overzealous he was when he was persecuting the church, right? So we're in a situation, to sum it all up, we need grace and we need a savior at the end of the day, right? This is the importance of Yahushua, right? So go over here. This is Galatians 2 verse 16, and it says, "Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Yahushua HaMashiach, even as we believe in Yahushua HaMashiach, that we might be justified by the faith of Yahushua HaMashiach, and not by the works of the law. For the works of the law shall no flesh be justified," right? Can we keep some of the laws? Absolutely, right? But we're in a situation where we need grace, right? And if I may add this aspect also, there's also, if you're surrounded with people who are essentially non-believers, they may have what's the word? I guess not rebuke per se, but they may have questioned you about what it is you believe. They may have tried to mock what it is you believe. There's a saying in the world that actions speak louder than words, right? So you conducting yourself in a particular way that exemplifies Yahushua, his character, it can lead, from what I've noticed, it can lead Israelites, who are not yet believers, to understand and essentially, have, how does it say in Romans? It says, let me see if I can get it real quick. It says in Romans that, be persuaded. That's the point. That's the word I'm looking for. Be persuaded in their own mind. Like, oh my goodness, this is what this person is doing is true, because the scriptures do talk about how a man should be known by his walk, right? So you carrying yourself in a particular way, it can do absolute, wonders, because Yahushua, working through you as a vessel good for the master's use, can shine a light upon those who are within your closest vicinity, right? If you dwell with those people peaceably, right? And I'm also kind of including some of my experience in this to kind of show you, this is a possibility that can happen, right? This is I guess I'll end off with this here. This is Philippians 2 verse 15, and it says that ye may be blameless and harmless sons of the Most High without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world, right? So this is the type of conduct that we strive to exemplify, right? And scriptures talk about how we essentially we put on therefore the elect, so those different traits, and eventually as time goes on and you gather more experience, you become more tempered. You realize you're not as rash as you used to be, right? You become more stable. You become more calm, more still. That's pretty much what I wanted to touch on, right? So hopefully all this makes sense, right? Because as I guess I'm speaking for other younger brothers who might feel that type of zeal, don't bring damnation upon your own situation, right? Because you have a zeal feeling, a fire, unkindled fire within you, right? Don't take that and destroy your own situation, your own living situation, right? And hammer some people over the head, with the law, right? But that's pretty much it. I sincerely pray and hope this lesson was edifying. I'd just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Makakodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone for teaching us truth. Until next time, I say, Shalom.